Alright, so today I have a video for you from Epic History TV, the Russian Revolution 1917. So let's go ahead and just dive right into that.
In 1894, Nicholas II became ruler of a Russian empire that stretched from the Baltic to the Pacific, inhabited by 126 million people from 194 ethnic groups. It was a country in which workers and peasants lived in poverty and hardship, while Russia's elite, its imperial family and aristocracy, lived lives of gilded luxury. There was a long history of struggle in Russia against the injustices of the system. And in 1905, a revolution forced the Tsar to allow the creation of a State Duma, or National Assembly. But its power was limited, and the compromise pleased neither the Tsar nor the reformers. In 1914, this divided empire...
Yeah, actually one of the problems with the first Duma was that they had the ability to create legislation and do all the things that Congress would do, except that the Tsar had the ability to say, no, we're not doing that. So if the Tsar decided that he didn't like what they were doing, he could just not do it. And the decision they had made could just be completely overridden. It was not a limit of his power. It was just sort of a, okay, you want in Congress, here you go. Here's a bunch of guys that are going to make decisions. And really it made the Tsar's life a little easier because they could make a lot of the decisions that he didn't have to. And if he didn't like the decision they made, he just made a different one. It was not what the people were looking for in 1905. They wanted the Tsar not to have that much power. That's why they revolted, but this is what they got.
Empire was plunged into fresh crisis by World War. World War I was a disaster for Tsarist Russia. At the front, the country suffered a series of devastating defeats, while at home there were food shortages and economic chaos. The Tsar was held responsible for the crisis. After all, he was now the army's commander-in-chief, and he was standing in the way of government reform. His German-born wife, Empress Alexandra, was even thought to be supporting Germany, while the entire family was said to have fallen under the spell of a Siberian mystic and faith healer, Grigory Rasputin. In December 1916...
Just real quickly, I know many of you have probably heard of Rasputin. I don't know how much you know about Rasputin. Please check him out. He's I stopped a lot of videos for this reason. They're just being a very interesting person that pops up and that you should just look into. Look at Rasputin. This man is extraordinarily interesting person. I'm sure there's plenty of things all over YouTube, all over Wikipedia, everything. Just look into him. He's a very, very interesting person. In a lot of ways, a little disturbing of a person, but he's very, very interesting.
Rasputin was murdered by Russian aristocrats, possibly with the help of British secret agents, both groups determined to end his influence over the Tsar. But in the eyes of many, the damage had already been done. On the 23rd of February 1917, thousands of women took to the streets of the Russian capital, Petrograd, to mark International Women's Day.
Yeah, just real quick before it gets into this part. So when I talk about the food shortages and everything, there was already a lot of problems with food supplies in Russia. Despite the ability of them to grow a lot of food in certain areas, other parts of the country were not able to as much. And so there was a lot of distribution issues within Russia. And a lot of the food that was available was very basic, bread and potatoes sort of thing. There wasn't a lot of people never really eat much meat or anything. It was very limited diets. So when food started to dry up during World War One, it was worsening a situation that was already bad. It's not like it was in, say, like Germany and others, where they're like, okay, there are food shortages starting to happen, but they're so used to having a lot more food, a lot more types of food available to them. They were much more well fed, and they were sort of able to just tighten their belts and go through it. When it happens in Russia, these people they can't tighten their belts anymore. They're already hungry. And it brings it to the breaking point that much faster. The problem with Russia at this time is that they are so far behind most of Europe in many ways that when they are put up against European powers, they are just not up to par. They are trying to compete with Europe literally in a war, but in other ways too, and they just can't do it. It's just not going to happen. They don't have the infrastructure, they don't have the industry, they don't have the agriculture. Despite being an agricultural country, they just don't even have enough food to maintain its people. You saw its population is massive, and they need to feed all these people, and it's very difficult for them to do so. Another thing I wanted to point out is that a big problem, the reason why that Rasputin had the influence that he had, was that during the war, things were going badly for the Russians very quickly. The Germans were really giving them the hurt, and so he blamed his generals. He thought they were all just being incompetent and that they were babies, and they needed his divine presence, his brilliant mind, to come and save the day. And he leaves the capital and leaves his advisors in charge, and Rasputin, being again the interesting individual he was very good at influencing people and getting people to do what he wanted to do. He sort of used his influence, and on top of this, you have a very out of touch aristocracy. They just don't understand the common people in any way. They're aliens to each other. But he goes to the front and takes command of the army himself, and the army still does horribly, and he just doesn't seem to understand why. He still thinks his commanders are not listening to him and all these sort of things. Sound familiar with anybody else, any other world leaders that we see during world wars? Somebody who just can't accept the fact that they're losing a war. It's always somebody else's fault. But yeah, he thought that it was the generals, and so he refused to return to the capital until the war started going in their favor. And he was an intelligent man. He was well educated and everything, but he wasn't a tactical genius or anything. He wasn't what he thought he was. He thought he was, this brilliant mind in every manner, and statesmanship and generalship and everything, and he just wasn't. He wasn't any of these things. He was capable, but that's about it. He goes to the lines, and it fails and fails and it fails, and the Russians still end up, being beaten back in the war until the situation in Petrograd gets so bad, he has to go back. And then the war just keeps going badly, and he's still in his mind is thinking about how they need him there, and his mind never quite leaves the front, and he never really gets back to governing the way that he should have. I don't think that he would have been able to ever stabilize the situation, but had he not been so disconnected in the first place and not been so wrapped up in himself, maybe these events could have not happened or not been nearly as extreme in nature.
And protest over bread shortages. The next day they were joined on the streets by workers and students carrying placards that read, "Down with the Tsar." Troops ordered to put down the disorder mutinied and joined the protesters instead. Tsarist officials were arrested. Prisons and police stations were attacked. Emblems of Tsarist rule smashed and burned. The government had lost control of the capital. The Tsar was told by his ministers that order could only be restored and Russia saved from military defeat if he gave up power. So, on the 2nd of March, Nicholas agreed to abdicate. In just 10 days, 300 years of Romanov rule had come to an end.
Yeah, there's actually a lot of stories that come out of the revolts there and the military mutinies. So they kept sending troops in order to bring order, and the troops would show up, and then they would just join the protesters. And these troops were still armed and everything. So if they sent anyone else, then now the protesters have soldiers on their side. There's stories of men in the Navy who would barricade off their ships. They would mutiny their captains and other officers and lock them up, and they would barricade the ship, and so that when officers tried to get back onto the ship, well, they have a battleship or a destroyer or some kind of warship. They have all of this at their disposal. They are basically their own little island, and there was really nothing anybody could do about it. They couldn't get on the ship there. You have an entire ship full of armed and angry sailors that do not want to go to war and do not agree with the Tsar and are having revolutionary thoughts. But yeah, the military sided with the people on this one. There was never a crackdown. I think that's the biggest difference between this revolution and many others that we see, is that the military doesn't really crack down in the beginning because they agree with them. They're like, yeah, we don't want to go to war. We're losing. We'll die. And, the people, like, they just want bread. They just want peace. That's what we want. We just want to go back home. We want to have food and live in peace. And we're fighting a war that we don't even have any stake in because we're not a representative government. We asked for representative government, and you gave us a powerless Duma. So people were pretty upset at the time. Obviously, they were revolting.
The February Revolution had been remarkably swift and bloodless, and hopes were now high for the creation of a more democratic, more just Russian state. Members of the State Duma, the National Assembly, had formed a provisional government, which was to hold power until a constituent assembly was elected, to give Russia a new constitution. But in reality, the provisional government shared power with the Petrograd Soviet, a council elected by workers and soldiers that controlled the capital's troops, transport, and communications. The Petrograd Soviet, dominated by the Socialist Revolutionary Party and the Marxist Menshevik Party, was much more radical than the provisional government. Yet it supported the government's decision to continue the war and honor the commitments that Russia had made to the Allies. It was a fateful decision that ultimately played into the hands of one of the smaller parties, the Bolsheviks. Their leader, Vladimir Lenin, recently returned from 16 years in exile, bitterly opposed the imperialist war. He also demanded the immediate redistribution of land, from rich landowners to peasants, and the transfer of power from the bourgeois provisional government to the people's soviets or councils that were springing up across Russia. The Bolshevik program was summed up in a simple slogan: bread, peace, and land. And as Russia's economic and military crisis deepened, its appeal to the masses grew and grew.
Yeah, really, that's all it really took. I mean, they had a real shot at having a democratic, even if it was a very left-wing democratic government, some form of social democracy. But the choice to stay in the war was devastating, because that was one of the things that was angering people the most. I mean, they were starting to protest over the lack of food, but the lack of food was because of the war. Hard working conditions was because of the war. And then you had all these men dying, people's fathers and sons and brothers were all dying in this war that no one agreed with. And then you get this new government, and you even get these radicals coming in on the left, the Mensheviks, and they're still agreeing to do the war. And there's even they were just so disconnected. It just shows a disconnect that, because the Duma was still made up of, they weren't aristocracy, but they were upper class type people, and it just shows a disconnect that people just didn't understand what the peasants wanted, didn't understand what the workers wanted. They just wanted bread, peace, and land. That's what they wanted. They wanted their fair share of everything, and they wanted peace, and they didn't want the war, and they didn't want the hardships that came with the war, and that's all that happened. If they had just said, okay, we're pulling out of the war, Russia had a real chance of being democratic. How long that would have lasted, I don't know. How well it would have taken, it's very hard to say. But that's really all it took, was just pull out of the war. Just pull out of the war. You're losing anyways. Like, you pull out, you get some terms, it's over. But they felt honor bound to stay in the war, and it would be politically devastating for them, because that's how Lenin really gets the influence that he gets, is by saying no war. The offers of bread and land were great too, but the redistribution of land and the ability to feed the population primarily comes from not having a war. So simply just ending the war would have already helped the food shortage, wouldn't really help the land issue, but reforms could have been put through anyways, now that the aristocracy was being taken out of power. But they didn't do it. Lenin said he was going to, and then he did. So he had the support of the people, because he gave them the very basics that they wanted, and then manipulated their support into forming the government that he did.
In June, a new Russian military offensive ended in disaster, with 400,000 Russian casualties, massive desertions, and the collapse of army morale and discipline. In July, soldiers and sailors in Petrograd mutinied. They were joined in the streets by workers with Bolshevik support. But troops loyal to the provisional government opened fire on the protesters and dispersed the crowds. A police crackdown followed, leading to the arrest of several Bolshevik leaders, including Leon Trotsky, while Lenin, with the help of Joseph Stalin, fled to Finland, traveling with forged papers under the name of Konstantin Ivanov. A socialist and stirring orator named Alexander Kerensky became Russia's new prime minister, and was hailed as the man who would save Russia from anarchy. The army's commander-in-chief, General Kornilov, believed Russia's war effort was being undermined by chaos at home, and deliberately sabotaged by men like Lenin, whom he declared a German spy. So in August, he ordered his men to march on Petrograd to restore order. Bolsheviks played a leading role in the city's defense against this attempted military coup. Their most brilliant organizer, Leon Trotsky, was released from prison and sent armed Bolshevik militias, the Red Guards, to defend key points in the city. Strikes by railway workers, many of them Bolshevik supporters, prevented Kornilov from moving his men by rail, and his soldiers began to switch sides, or simply go home. The Kornilov affair cast the Bolsheviks as saviors of the revolution, and by the end of September, they'd gained a majority in the Petrograd Soviet. In October, Lenin decided the time had come. He secretly returned from Finland to Petrograd and began preparing to seize power. On the 25th of October, the Bolsheviks made their move. Red Guards and loyal troops seized key points around the capital, and that night they stormed the provisional government's headquarters at the Winter Palace, an event later immortalized by Bolshevik propaganda and the great Soviet filmmaker Sergei Eisenstein. Kerensky fled the city at the last moment, narrowly avoiding capture. And the next day, at the Second All-Russian Congress of Soviets, Lenin announced the overthrow of the provisional government. The following months saw the Bolsheviks consolidate their hold on power, while fighting a brutal civil war against counter-revolutionary, or White Russian, forces who had foreign support. Some whites hoped to put Tsar Nicholas back on the throne.
Yeah, there was a lot of foreign support for the White Russians. Germany helped the best that they could. Obviously, they were embroiled in World War I at the time, but even countries like the United States sent support. Nobody wanted a communist country to take over. Nobody wanted them to be successful. So a lot of countries, Western countries, put support in for the whites the best that they could. With World War I happening at the time, it really limited the amount of support that they give them. But for Germany, the plan was that once they defeat France and Britain, they were going to turn around and go back to Russia and side with the whites and wipe out the Bolsheviks. Britain and France sort of had a similar idea of helping the whites, but they were not ready to actually engage in warfare after World War I. They sort of decided that it wasn't quite worth to go and throw all those lives away. But they definitely threw the support at it. They allowed volunteers to go and everything. They just never formally sent in the military. But there was a lot of support for the White Russians, whereas there was really no international support for the Bolsheviks. Nobody really wanted to see them succeed.
After his abdication, Nicholas and his family had been held under guard at Tsarskoye Selo, outside Petrograd, where they occupied themselves with gardening and other diversions. In summer 1917, the family was sent to Tobolsk in Siberia, where they lived under house arrest in the governor's mansion. The following spring, the Bolsheviks had the family moved to Yekaterinburg. In July 1918, as white forces approached the city, Bolshevik soldiers gathered the whole family in a cellar the Tsar, his wife, their son Alexei, their 4 daughters, Olga, Tatiana, Maria, and Anastasia, as well as 4 servants, and executed them all. Russia's civil war was one of the 20th century's most devastating events. An estimated 2 million soldiers lost their lives, while a typhus epidemic and famine claimed the lives of a further 9 million civilians. By the end of 1921, the Bolsheviks had emerged victorious, and under Lenin's determined and uncompromising leadership, set about building a new socialist order. The Soviet Union, created in 1922, emerged as a world superpower following the defeat of Nazi Germany in World War II. But it would always remain a single-party state, where all opposition or dissent was ruthlessly suppressed. Those brief hopes for Russian democracy that flowered amid the euphoria of the February Revolution were extinguished by the Bolshevik October Revolution, and put beyond reach for decades to come. Bridgman Images are the leading supplier.
So yeah, like I said before, Russia had a real chance at some form of democracy, probably a social democracy of some sort, but the provisional government's insistence on continuing the war, and even the Mensheviks, the majority communist party at the time, they were still in favor of it too. Everyone was still in favor of it, and the people did not want it. And that was why they kept revolting, and the whole thing goes on. That is why October Revolution happens. You know, the military cracks down, and all they want is for the war to end. That's primarily what everyone wants, because then a lot of the other problems become solved, or become a lot more easily solved once the war is over. Like I said, Russia was going to lose anyways. Everyone knew it. So why keep fighting? Just give the Germans what they want and be done with it. We don't care about imperial conquest. We don't care about that. We just want the war to end. We want our bread and our potatoes and our vodka. But very simple. We want peace, bread, and vodka. Who doesn't? But yeah, it was just such a bad decision. It was absolutely bad decision. And then you get someone like Lenin leading the Bolsheviks, and Lenin was an absolute revolutionary. To his core, he was revolutionary. And during his times in exile, he met with Trotsky a lot. They were actually pretty close. And where they tended to disagree on certain things, specifically on how a government should be run. Trotsky, originally being a Menshevik, believed more in a, I don't want to say democratic, but a little more representative government, less of a dictatorship. Less central authority, more of a confederation of Soviets sort of thing. Whereas Lenin wanted a little more, someone to be at the helm. He thought that even though the power should relate with the workers and with the Soviets, somebody still has to be at the helm to make sure that everything goes smoothly. And that's really where they tended to disagree. But overall, they agreed on a lot of things. I mean, Trotsky was a hardcore revolutionary all the way through too. They both were. I think that's why they were such good friends. Is they both saw the same problems, and they had a lot of the same resolutions to those problems. They had a few disagreements on things, but overall they really agreed. And Lenin really wanted a revolution for a long time. He talked about revolution for a very long time. Now, he thought it was going to be in Germany. He thought that Germany was going to send a revolution. Seeing that Karl Marx was German, he saw the conditions that Germany was in during the war and the uprisings of the workers and the discontent among the people, and he thought for sure that it was going to be Germany. When it starts happening in Russia, when you see the February Revolution, everything, he's kind of, oh, it's happening here, and he goes there. He riles up, he forms the Bolsheviks and riles them up, and is able to seize power. He was someone that was very influential. He was very charismatic. He was an excellent statesman. He could really rile up a crowd. He could really rally people behind him, even though he was not working in everyone's best interest. He could make them think that he was. He was one of those people that just really was able to rally people behind him very, very easily, and his fervor and his revolutionary mind really gave the people what they want, because he was able to get everybody really angry. Everybody got really angry. They were getting angry on their own. He was able to just really kind of fan those flames and then use that anger to and direct it the way that he wanted to, which is a theme that we see over and over again when new leaders take over and new parties take over, usually through revolution of some sort. But yeah, he was excellent at all of that. He was very charismatic, and if you read any of his works, I suggest reading it out of just curiosity. I have them around here somewhere. Yeah, he was very well spoken, very well read, very intelligent man. He had all the qualities to pull this off. Someone like Stalin had none of the qualities to pull this off. Trotsky probably could have. I don't know how effective he would have been in comparison, but I think that Trotsky definitely had the ability to pull off something similar, although he did side with the Mensheviks early on, so I don't think it would have been nearly as extreme. Like I said, he disagreed with Stalin, yeah. He disagreed with Stalin on literally everything, but he disagreed with Lenin on whether or not there should be someone at the helm, if there should be a leader of the Soviet Union and not just a council of some form. But really without Lenin, this just doesn't really happen. You don't see this Bolshevik revolution, regardless of who's in power and everything. He was the focus, and it was him and his personality and his intelligence and all these things that really led to this series of events happening that the way that they did from the October Revolution forward. And yeah, like I said, he's just one of those figures. And then you have the Civil War, the Russian Civil War. We look at we look at the war, and it's a very brutal, very ugly, very, very, very bloody war between the two sides, and there was a lot of international support for the whites, as I said, whereas there was really next to none for the Bolsheviks. Even among the socialist groups, they were sort of fighting with the Bolsheviks only because the line had been drawn. You were on this side, you were on this side. But even those socialist groups who disagreed with Lenin, a lot of things that the Mensheviks and others all fought on his side of the war. But the sad part about the Russian Civil War is that it gets overshadowed by World War One. World War One is happening when it starts. World War One ends during it, and everyone is so focused on the aftermath of World War One, which is huge. With the powers being stripped from Germany and the Treaty of Versailles and all of that, everyone sort of overlooks what's happening in Russia. And what's happening in Russia is extremely important, and it's extremely bloody and ugly and awful. But it doesn't get the same attention from historians, from really anyone. Didn't get the same attention at the time. A lot of people were concerned about what was going on, but they were more focused on, oh boy, we just won a war, and then the countries that lost the war were worried about, well, we just lost the war, now we have to put ourselves back together. They're too busy rebuilding. Everyone was busy rebuilding, but the countries that lost were now, shattered empires, and they were in no position to do anything about it. And those that were, the victorious countries were too busy. They were also rebuilding, recovering from the war, but they also had this idea of the sentiment of just like, oh boy, we won the war, we're the big guys. but at the same time, we don't want to do this again, so we're not going to go to Russia and help them. And they just kind of ignored what was going on for the most part, the best that they could. And so it does get overlooked in history. It's a huge part of Russian history, and really it turns into a huge part of world history, because it leads to the rise of the Soviet Union, and which is a monumental change in history, and it leads to monumental changes in Europe, and then leads to the Cold War, which is monumental changes in world history. So this event is very, very important. And we often hear about the revolution, but not so much the Civil War, which is just as important as the rest of it. So that's why I wanted to do this video when I saw it, because they don't really talk so much about the Civil War, but they give a very quick understanding of it, and I think it's very important to understand what happened there. This is a very important revolution and a very important Civil War that happens. We still feel the effects of it today. There are the fact that there is still a Communist Party in China and in North Korea and in Vietnam all plays into this event. The antagonism between the United States and Russia today plays into this event. The United States and Russia actually got along pretty well before this. During the Civil War, Russia had given support to the Union to defeat the South, but I mean nothing really substantial. But they definitely thought highly of the Union and of the United States. But it's after this that everything starts to decline, and relations never really have mended. Putin and being in power doesn't really help, and the leaders we've had doesn't really help. But a lot of it all stems from this period, this moment in history. So it's a very important moment of history. It's often overlooked because of World War One, but really we have to think of this as being part of World War One. World War One doesn't just end in 1918 when Germany surrenders. The lingering effects of World War One continue to happen, and primarily here in Russia. And you have to understand this to really understand what's going to happen in the world. If you want, and we think about the Treaty of Versailles, and we think about what happened in Germany as the states of what happens in World War II. But the Soviet Union was a massive player in World War II. If we don't look at what was happening in Russia and understand how things played out in Russia, how are we supposed to understand World War II? So, yeah, this is a very important event. That's why I really wanted to do this video when I saw it, and Epic History TV does amazing videos. I'm definitely going to be doing a lot of theirs. I've already started the Napoleonic series. I see they have a lot more in Russian Revolution and Russian history, which, Russian history, I took a lot of that in college. It's very interesting stuff, so I'm very excited to do those videos. But anyway, I'm going to go ahead and end the video there. If you have any other videos you'd like me to take a look at, please put in the comment section, whether they're history or alternate history. I will certainly check them out. If you like this video, please like and subscribe, and I will see you next time.